Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio. Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh here with an all-star cast, our good buddy Eve Mulkers of 7W Data, along with our good buddy David Sweener, now with Elation, but also Tiny Tech Guides. And in fact, David and Eve recently published a book on generative AI through Tiny Tech Guides. Hop online and do a search for that. If you want to get the book, it's a fantastic book. They've done a comprehensive job of breaking down what's happening in the world of Gen AI, what the different models are all about, and business use cases. How do you use this stuff? It's very powerful, but it must be used appropriately. And we've also got Michael Gilfix from KX on the line, very fast, high powered database company, great in financial services. We'll get his thoughts on what's happening in the Gen AI world as well. And let me just start with my thoughts very quickly, folks. This is amazing technology. These Gen AI models are doing amazing things already. You have to be careful when and how you use them. Eve was talking about use cases for healthcare, and if you read the terms and certain conditions of Open AI's ChatGPT, it says, "Nah, don't do that. Like, don't use it for healthcare. We don't want to get involved in lawsuits." There are guardrails baked into these things, as I showed in the presentation before this show. The image generation stuff is not quite that great yet. I tried to get Gemini today to generate an image of a RAG model, of a retrieval augmented generation model, and it gave me some image that looked like it was a lady from Burning Man. Something I was like, and that's not really what I was looking for. I was looking for something a little more business friendly. So it's still kind of edgy. It's not there yet. But remember, it is just a predictive engine. And all it's really doing is reflecting back to you information based on weightings of vectors. So when you embed your corporate data, which you must do, and I've said it before, RAG models, in my opinion, are the key to enterprise Gen AI. If you do not have a sophisticated RAG model, don't do Gen AI, or at least be very careful about it. Use it only for internal purposes or use it to spur your creativity, but don't put something in production that's customer facing, at least not right away. You need to play with this stuff to understand what it is, how it works, and what it doesn't do well. And don't be surprised when it does strange things. For any topic that is that has been widely published, you'll get really good responses from these Gen AI engines. For fringe stuff, it's going to be harder. For facts, it's going to be harder. That's why you want a RAG model, retrieval augmented generation. And the way that works is it creates almost like your anchors of truth or your ballast, your grounding. You will use your curated, trusted corporate data, governed. Be careful what you put in these things. I keep saying training models like these is like raising kids. If you curse in front of your kids when they're 2 years old, they're going to be cursing right back at you at 2 years and a half. That's probably not what you want. I mean, maybe you're a very edgy parent and you like that stuff. Most parents don't want that, right? So be careful. Whatever you train these things with, they will reflect back to you, sometimes at very inappropriate times. That's what you want to watch out for. So RAG models are going to be crucial. And the other thing I'll say is that, folks, generative AI is just one flavor of AI. There's a whole lot of other AI that's been proven, tested, has great use cases, has great success stories. You don't need to use Gen AI for everything. The good thing about Gen AI is that it has opened the minds of executives everywhere. I promise you, every major business in the country and all around the world is now looking at this stuff, trying to figure out how to use it. So think through your use cases. As my friend Bao Hui said the other day on one of our shows, use it for an internal use case. Get your team playing around with it first. It's like skiing. You don't just slap on skis and go down the hill first time. You got to work on this stuff and be careful about it because you can injure yourself skiing if you don't know what you're doing. And you can injure your company and your reputation if you use this stuff in production too quickly and don't know what you're doing. So, with that, I will bring in our guest. Maybe we'll get an opening statement from each of you on what's going on with Gen AI in your world. Eve Mulkers, of course, you know a lot about this stuff, and you're using this stuff. You were using it before the big engines came out, right? So tell us what your thoughts are on where it's really appropriate to use it and maybe where it's not.
Well, definitely in content creation and marketing aspects, Gen AI is all over the place. That's what we see, and it's becoming better because you can ragify your model and optimize it in such a way. My personal interest is more into data management and how these Gen AI tools can help us better understand our data And there is a big opportunity what is coming in the world. We see it as well when we're talking, Eric, both of us, to the vendors, understanding on how they implement Gen AI into their tool set to create better data pipelines and go faster on creating value out of the data from their business.
Yeah, and let's go around the horn here. David Sweener, co-author of the Tiny Tech Guide on Generative AI. What are your thoughts about where this stuff is and what people should do with it now today?
As Eve and I, outlined in our book, there are so many applications of generative AI out there, and a lot of it is in content creation. But I think the point to be made is it's just going to parrot back sort of what has already been fed into it. Some of that you can control with RAG, some of it you can't. The foundation models have been built with data that was essentially harvested indiscriminately, from the internet and lots of other sources. So there's a lot of, probably not so nice things in these foundation models that nobody really wants to admit. But, I'm in work in the marketing group, and, our philosophy here is, we use it, but we create, like a thought leadership topic as an example. And we'll use it for summarization and repurposing things. It's not going to create thought leadership for you, but I'm not going to have to write every little nurture email or, every little ad, we have out in Google. So we use it more for like a summarization perspective. But, I think it has great potential. And Eric, I liked your opening statement. Don't forget about traditional or predictive AI. It's got a lot of names out there, but that is still, I think, one of the main workhorses out there.
Old-fashioned AI, we should call
That's
it.
right.
We should call it old-fashioned AI versus the newfangled AI. I'll throw it over to Michael Gilfix of KX. You're out there in the real world doing very serious work in financial services, very high-powered database, fast, very fast, been fast for years. What are you thinking about this Gen AI stuff? Where do you use it? Where do you recommend people use it?
So the thing that gets me really excited is I think there's a revolution going on in businesses where they can finally tap into their unstructured data and use it for the advantage of their business, being
Hmm.
smarter about their customers, providing new services, better targeting them, tweaking their customer journey and customer service. And Gen AI is the killer use case that's driving the use and unlocking the value of that unstructured data.
Hmm.
And that's going to be a huge revolution because everyone has known for a long time that data can make or break a business, but they were only using a fraction of their data. Now, with things like language models that can encode data, make it searchable and usable, now I can use a large language model to help summarize data I couldn't make sense of and to
Hmm.
generate new content. I can take unstructured data like images and video and then turn that into interesting applications. That's going to open up a whole new level of being able to use data to personalize service. And in the financial industry, we see people wanting to use that for market advantage. How do I incorporate research and factor in all these unstructured documents to improve my algorithm, my risk management, my products, my targeting of my end customers?
Hmm. That's an excellent point. I think you're exactly correct. And what gets me really excited, and maybe I'll throw this back at you, Michael, is inserting an LLM into a certain part of a workflow. So the LLMs are very good at pattern recognition, and they'll see things that you don't see, and just, of course, using it in research purposes. So when I try to compare vendors, and again, the content that it has absorbed is what it's using to reflect back. So that's why I said if something has been widely published about, like how computers work, for example, or even how a nuclear power plant works, there's a lot of documentation on that. So anytime there's a large repository of extant content, it's very good at sort of capturing all that and giving you the breakdown. And you can tell when you look at the answers that it has a certain ideal structure it likes to give you. It likes bullet points, it likes numbers, it likes saying, oh, these are the four categories you need to look at, but it's very good at that. And what I've noticed is it will pick up on things that you had not thought of. So, as David Sweener was mentioning, it's great for the first part of a creative process to kind of map out what are the topical domains we want to include in this article on applied AI, for example. It will give you a really good starting point now. That's where human creativity should come in. create content around that, but it's great for giving you a baseline to work
Mhm.
with, and that is not a small deal, right, Michael?
Yeah, I would say there's three workflow patterns that you see people use LLMs to do. Find me something, that's a search problem. Summarize me something, because I can't make sense of all this data. And then synthesize me something new. And then usually a human has to review that before it gets put out into the wild.
Right.
But the quality of the AI output is only as good as the input. And I think you're on a very important point there, which is what most people don't realize is large language models during training don't actually learn facts, but rather they infer facts by encoding parameters into these large language models, and then they synthesize what sounds like very convincing facts.
Right.
That's how everyone knows about hallucinations. So
Mhm.
the large language model actually interpolates using its parameters facts. And if there's
Mhm.
enough parameters that have been learned, then the facts sound pretty accurate until they're not.
Yeah. That's true.
Databases, on the other hand, have to tell you exactly what the database knows. And so that's why people look at things like retrieval augmented generation, because the database is supplying real facts, meaning only what the database knows. And
Mhm.
now the quality of the input into the generative engine is better, which means that the output that you're going to get is that much more accurate. And you can do those three things I said. You can find things of interest, you can help make sense of large amounts of data, and you can generate some pretty convincing new content using some of the really impressive trained large language models out there.
Yeah, and real quick back to you, Michael. From your experience, how do you actually persist in a vector database data from a relational database? Do you load tables individually? Do you load the whole database as a file? Can you walk us through what that looks like or whatever you know about it?
So it depends, frankly, which vector database you pick. Certainly, if you pick ours, some can handle structured data and unstructured data. Some can only do unstructured data. A lot of some of the pure play vector databases struggle with how much structured data they can use.
Hmm.
But if you can load in both, you would load in your structured data as is. And then when you take your unstructured data, you have to encode that data. And there's language models if it's text, or there's image models you can use. And what that does is it converts your data into basically a mathematical array called a
Hmm.
vector that
Hmm.
then allows these systems to go and find your data. And there's
Hmm.
tons of models out there. And if you're using text, you'll hear about the infamous chunking problem, which is how do you break your text up so that I can find the right fact faster? And that's part of the encoding step. That then allows us to find the right information at the right granularity so the AI can do its thing.
Hmm. And we have in our live studio audience here, we've had a couple of great comments from attendees, and one just said, "There's no such thing as unstructured data." And I'm like, I agree with you. I think that is exactly correct. Typically, when we use the word structured, I think the implication is we're talking about data in a relational database. It's structured in that particular, very precise sense. But you're right. All data is structured. I mean, all content is structured in some fashion. And that's what's really quite compelling about these LLMs. I'll throw this over to Eve to comment on maybe. I'm fascinated by the way in which they're able to reflect back prosaic responses that feel like articles. And in fact, I'll be giving a presentation at the Data Universe Conference April 10th and 11th. April 10th is my first one, and then I'll do a panel on the 11th on the death of journalism. And what I'm basically saying there is that data driven information will be the future of news, or at least for business people, because that's what business people want is they want facts. I mean, you get stories around the facts, but really what you want is the information of what happened, how does that impact me? And there's no media organization in the universe that can withstand the pressure of these large language models, especially as the RAG models get better and better and more fine-tuned. There's no way any media company with human beings banging out words all day can keep up with the variety, with the velocity of what's happening, none of that stuff, or the personalization that people are going to need. So in the future, you're going to have your own capacity to just interact with these large language models as if they are reporters working for you, gathering information, giving you stories about what matters, and then allowing you to rewrite the story in a context that is relevant to what you need. So you would hit the system and say, hey, how does this new law affect my health insurance company in Maryland? Well, what if I'm only 10 employees? What if I decide to go into some other space as well? And immediately you get prosaic responses telling you the impact of these laws, of these regulations, of the market, all kinds of different things. That is going to be the future of journalism. And the biggest irony I see is that all these fact checkers you keep hearing about that are fact checking people talking, well, the fact checkers are not going to fact check the AI responses. So we're going to be working for the machines. But Eve Mulkers, I'll ask you to comment on that. What do you think?
Well, you put some things pretty clear, I think, Eric. If you talk about journalism, to my belief as well, it's data storytelling what will help us in such a respect, explaining the numbers that you see in a way we can better understand it. That's one of the big interesting points on how we can bring that out. The data storytelling is the large language models are as well capable of giving you the context, of giving you the rationale on such a thing. We as humans, we really have to learn on how to do that. The critical thinking, the explanation, building the context around that. One point you touched upon is as well by specifying this or tailoring whatever you're saying to a specific audience. So the same kind of message can easily be transposed to an academic audience or just to just younger people. Give the same message, but in an easier, understandable way. And you touched upon the point where you say the AI won't be controlling the AI. Well, I think that's the way we are going. We're building agents, and one agent can control the other agent. And
Hmm.
that's what I see happening in this world as well, where we say you produce the facts, but the other agent will challenge that. And we will give them guardrails on how to challenge each other. And together they will produce a better research result. I've seen some agents playing around, still some drift off and get some hallucinations. But on the other hand, where you say this is the role playing agent of a researcher, and this is the manager of the researchers, and they all together bring you the results. And I think that will implement some of the guardrails on getting better AI and trustworthy AI in such a way.
Yeah, I think that's exactly correct. Adversarial training, basically, where they train each other. And sounds kind of scary. The AI models training each other. It's like, they'll be training each other all night. You wake up, they've learned new things. Like, uh-oh. Well, folks, don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. You are listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back here on DM Radio with an all-star cast. Eve Mulkers of 7W Data, David Sweener of Alation and Tiny Tech Guides, and Michael Gilfix of KX, and of course yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh, talking all about large language models from rag to riches. That's right, retrieval augmented generation. It is the key for enterprise Gen AI. Full stop. That's my take, at least. You need to use this stuff and understand how it works. And there will be very sophisticated models. I mean, I guarantee it's out there already. But the people who are really on the cutting edge of this stuff, they are just head and shoulders above the rest. And folks, you've got to use this stuff. I mean, you have to use it, if nothing else, just to kind of prod yourself and your own understanding of topics. And one of our attendees pointed out the crucial importance of semantics. This actually gets into the small language models. And maybe David Swinner, I'll throw it over to you. That was my favorite part of your Tiny Tech Guide, by the way, where you went into these different small language models. There are ones that are for specific industries. So think specific ontologies, for example. So legal stuff for lawyers, for judicial cases, for case law, for example. In the legal world, there are all sorts of semantics where the words have very specific meanings, and there are all sorts of rules around processes, right? Like a motion to dismiss, or all the different motions that you could do at any given time. And knowing the rules and regulations around that according to your bar association in your state is pretty important stuff. Case law, federal, county, municipal, whatever it is. It's a very complicated world that we have spent tons of money as a culture paying lawyers tons of money to do stuff that, guess what, the LLMs can now do for you. Now there are some stories out there which I think are FUD, basically, of foolish lawyers who went out and had ChatGPT write their briefs for them and they didn't check it. But don't let that fool you. This stuff is extremely compelling and it can reflect back to you formats like filing a motion to dismiss, for example. So I'll throw it over to David. The small language models with their precise ontologies and baked in semantics, I think that's the future. And I think that's actually what Sam Altman was hinting at when he said a few months ago that the era of LLMs is over. And everyone was like, what? What did you say? What do you think, David?
I think that's a good point. That was some of the research that Eves and I did in the book. I wasn't aware there's chemical language models. So if you want to synthesize proteins, you use heavily in the pharmaceutical industry. So it's quite interesting. Um, with generative AI, everybody on this call here has been in the industry for quite a while. And what I find really fascinating is it's put the focus on back to the data. Data has always been a mess. It's been of poor quality. I'm working at, Elation, the data intelligence company. The importance of metadata, I didn't really truly understand it until I started working for Elation. And for those who don't know what that is, think about searching on Amazon. You type in shoes. There are 80 different filters for shoes. How can you find the right shoe for you? And that's what all these filters are. And that's what metadata is. And, many of the customers I speak with on a daily basis, they're using metadata to train and fine tune their large language models. And they're doing it across every industry. And we just had this particular customer isn't doing, but we just did a webinar with GKN Aerospace out of Gothenburg, highly regulated. They're using generative AI in a lot of their work. So it's just quite interesting. And I think, understanding your data, understanding the meaning, semantics, and the metadata around it is critical for any company out there.
Yeah. And Brian, I'm sorry, Michael, I'll throw another question over at you. And I'm going to give you the hard questions, man, because you seem to know cool stuff, right? The semantics, there are layers to these models, right? Any deep learning module has layers. You have different layers through which the data is basically sifted and then reorganized and shaken and so forth. And what you're trying to do is look for patterns, right? That's the key, is find some pattern of meaning. And then with these large language models and your vector databases, you're doing similarity searches basically. So they already have all these vectors baked in basically. And what you're doing is you're using your vector database or your repositories, these anchors of truth, to direct the engine of the LLM to give you highly focused content. That's the whole idea. Where does semantics come into play here? Is, in other words, different in like David just said, certain industries like the chemical industry has a key set of semantics. Would you, for example, load into your private LLM a dictionary of terms, like your own data catalog, for example? And my point is, can it read an ontology per se? Can it actually understand an ontology? Or would you just have to load in all sorts of definitions separately for it to understand those things?
So there's so first, just to put in context with RAG, there's a complementary component to RAG, which is getting your large language model to understand a domain.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a few different tricks by which people approach those things. So one is they take a foundation model, think of that as like a pre-built model, and then
Mm-hmm.
they do specific training to
Mm-hmm.
get a domain set of knowledge. The other is people use things like fine tuning. And fine tuning is where you basically teach your large language model various prompts, and it can then learn facts, terminology, et cetera, that are in a given domain.
Mm-hmm.
And there's tons of terminology that has expressions and things like that that are very specific to a domain that even you nor I would understand what they were unless we happen to work there, or work in that area. I remember I went to school in Boston. I grew up in Montreal. When I went to school in Boston, I learned the expression of a townie, which is basically someone who grew up in Boston, has a really good Boston accent. But if you'd not lived in Boston, you would not know what a townie is, right? So for the town of Boston. And so that's a great example, though, of something that is very specific to a culture. Turns out if you go into all these different work areas, we talked a bit about legal. There's these very specific terms that have to be learned. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's the benefit of domain specific training. You're helping the LM to better understand those terms and to synthesize things that make sense in that context. But you
Mm-hmm.
still need the RAG architecture to supply the facts. There's no substitute for the facts, but the synthesis will be that much more accurate, and its ability to understand what you mean when you prompt it will be that much more effective through domain specific training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll throw this one over to Eve. I wrote an article a few weeks ago about Kong, which is basically it's an API gateway. And as I was talking to this gentleman, the CTO, He was saying that, yeah, you can actually use this gateway as part of your guardrail strategy for LLMs, because typically you're going to be going from your on-prem environment up into the cloud to get to an LLM to get some sort of an answer. And in between you and that LLM is the gateway. So you can actually bake in your guardrails. And I gave an example already, I think, about politics, right? So if you ask Gemini, which is the tool that I use, anything about elections in the United States, it's going to balk and say, "Oh, elections are complex. Don't ask me anything about that. Please go to Google for that." Because they don't want to get in trouble because they know they can just make some stuff up and then bad things are going to happen. So even the gateway can be part of your RAG model. You can bake your guardrails into there. It's a pretty effective way. Eve, what do you think about the importance of guardrails and really the critical importance of getting the training or at least the vectorization process, the embedding process right for your organization? What do you think?
Well, it reminds me of the days back, just dimensional modeling, building data warehouses, getting the contextual understanding of the data that what you were looking at, discussions about what is a customer, what is a product as such. So we were already discussing the semantics of the meaning of data to get that directly correct. You had the conform dimensions where you were trying to build that dimension that overspanned various departments in your organization. So again, this is where it goes. And I do understand what you say if we talk about the importance of semantics and the embeddings and the vectorization. You do a transformation into a different understanding, into mapping that into a mathematical model, and then reverting that back. So you could say there goes something away in the transformation, in the translation from one into the other model and turning that back. So there could be a risk as such in how these transformers are built and missing out. I just think of a uh, real real example, and that is in the music. If you say the audio waves are transformed into MP3s and back and forth, you lose some of the quality as such. But over time, the
Lossy.
transformers to do that, they became better in doing that. So now even compressed music really sounds really great because you have the encoding and the decoders that have been optimizing for do that. And I think that's where we are going with the vectorization of the models as well.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. And David, I'll throw this one over to you. I played around a few months ago actually with Gemini and found it's very good at something called ETL. So I just did a scrape from, I think it was the CES website. I wanted a list of companies to reach out to for business development purposes. And I just did a screen scrape like Command A, Command C, pasted it into a Google Doc, and then I took all that and I pasted it into Gemini and I said, please give me an alphabetical list of just the company names in this blob of text. And there was all kinds of other text in there, and it just went bing, 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 bop, 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 just banged it all out perfectly. Well, then I said, add a separate column of Twitter handles for all these companies. And it went bop, 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 bop. And it would stop at a certain point. You have to tell it to keep going. So I'm sure that's baked into to control costs and to control compute. Now, I will say it was not too good at the Twitter handles. Half of them were wrong. So it was just making stuff up there. But still, it was very good. I mean, to look at a blob of text like that and in a traditional fashion, get just the company names out would have been a nightmare. All right. Would have taken some intern all day long to do this thing. It took Gemini, like, I don't know, 2 minutes and 10 seconds with 4 separate attempts. That's pretty interesting. And that's where I'm saying in workflows, you can start with a real messy blob of text, have it clean out, basically cull from that environment only the stuff that you want, and then you go to your next step, which is in some traditional technology. That's where I think this stuff is going. But what do you think, David?
Yeah, I think that's a great example there. I created a course for someone over the winter, and so I used it to create synthetic data. Great use case. And the course was on, data visualization and analytics. And I asked it, what are data visualization best practices? I'm not, so give me that. I said, recreate these visualizations using best practices. And it did a great job. The thing I found interesting was if you ask it the same question again or in a different session, it you get a completely different output. And so you have to sort of, it's not really repeatable, and it was just an epiphany for me. And the other thing I learned in that exercise, and and Michael might know the answer to this. Everybody say, "Hey, ChatGPT, it's so smart." Like, why can't it read a table out of a PDF? Like, I put in some 10Ks. I'm like, oh, analyze this table, and I was surprised. I was baffled that it couldn't do it, and I haven't seen a lot of people talking about that. But I'd love to hear, if anybody here has a thought on that. Can't read a table.
Michael, what do you think?
Yeah, it turns out the problem of doing OCR on documents is surprisingly harder than it sounds. There's a lot of tricks that it takes depending on your formats of your tables and where they are. I remember I once worked on a problem where we had to go and parse these documents, and they were good shipped across the border, and they had stamps on them. Sometimes they were scanned really poorly. You couldn't read the text. So turns out that actually extracting it is pretty tricky.
Hmm. Well, I think the general rule here with LLMs, at least at the moment, is they are fantastic for stochastic use cases. In other words, for creative processes of trying to understand generally what's happening, give yourself some ideas, but again, also get outlines of things. Anything that is widely published, it's going to be pretty good at getting you some useful information. Now, again, you have to vet that stuff. You have to go through and make sure and double check, but it's like, who has time for double checking, right? And as regards my speech that's coming up, one of the things I'm going to say is that in the Data Universe conference is that, I remember when I saw this whole fact checker thing rolling out, and that's when I knew that news was in trouble. Because let's face it, in a news organization, it is the reporter's job to find the story, to get the facts, to check the facts, then write the story and send it to the editor. So now, if you have these fact checkers, you've basically decoupled facts from the storytelling, which means the articles are just narratives. They're just storytelling, and fact check is some separate process, which is absolutely insane. Okay, I think that's completely bonkers that you would have that. And you also have fact checkers for social media. So major organizations like Reuters and some others, they have their own fact checkers that just scan social media and they'll break things down, and you get these big long articles that they write of where they're trying to check the facts that they found on social media. And what annoys me there is thinking, yeah, you know what, had big media just done a good job of telling us what was actually happening, there wouldn't be all this mistrust and there wouldn't be all this social media stuff that's going around making things up. So, there is a responsibility on the side of the media to get things right and to make sure they get things right. And there are really simple rules to follow. I'll talk about this in my speech. For example, says, S-A-Y-S, my first editor ever in 1990, Bob Norfleet told me says should be like punctuation in a news article. He says this, she says that. Here's what we verified, usually via what someone else said. Point being, you should never read in a news article, Senator Jones believes something or Senator Jones fears something. You don't know what this person believes or fears. You know what they say they believe or say they fear. And it's very important to respect that boundary because you just don't know. But folks, don't touch that. I'll be right back. You're listening to a very fun episode of DM Radio. All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, talking to a whole bunch of experts. We've got Michael Gilfix from KX, David Sweener of Alation and Tiny Tech Guides, and Eve Mulkers of 7W Data, talking all about Gen AI from rag to riches. I was talking with Dr. Catherine Ordoon from Booz Allen in our nation's capital just a couple days ago for an event hosted by Booz Allen at the Helix, which is a very cool building. It's like 2 blocks from the White House. And she said some pretty fun things to me. And maybe, Eve, I'll throw this over to you first. She was telling me that anyone who tells you that they can get rid of hallucinations with Gen AI is either lying or ignorant. Like, and her point was, and this really drove it home for me. Her point was the foundation of all this stuff is probabilistic math. So you're converting all your text to mathematical vectors, basically a point and a trajectory and a length, basically. And then the similarity searches are looking for where do we have vectors like this compared to vectors like that. Of course, Craig Schmidhuber with the transformer models really opened the door to these things. And as I recall, the papers he wrote were like in the 1990s. So it's really interesting to kind of see how this industry evolves. The ideas have been there for a long, long time. What we didn't have was the compute and the power and the expertise basically to leverage these things to make some cool use of them. That's all now happening at breakneck speed. But Eve, I thought her warning was was pretty stark and pretty clear. you're never going to completely get rid of these things, but you can get a whole lot closer. And we should remember that humans make mistakes all the freaking time, right? Go ahead, Eve.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Who's not hallucinating from time to time, or doing some imagining some stuff? But I was thinking while you were expressing that is we as humans we learn so many years to understand an industry and get a gut feeling of what we've been told, if that is correct or incorrect. So kind of judgment what we've
Right.
learned over time. We're not always correct either because we're getting biased by our education about the environments we live in. And if we see at the large language models, how long have they been learning on a massive amount of context in written context in out there on the internet? And I think if we just wait for a longer time, we will see that these hallucinations will boil down. We will find ways of doing the predictions and the guesstimates getting correcter by feeding them even more information. But we still have that emotional intent, which is not yet there in the large language models. So I think we're still pretty safe on getting augmented by the large language models and not fully depending on them.
Yeah, right. Well, and my buddy Andy Hanna from 1486 Labs, he says something that resonates with me, and I've also heard it from the folks at the Northeastern Institute over there. I'll throw this over to Michael to comment on. Treat these LLMs, treat this form of AI as a member of your team and just have it there at the ready to bounce ideas off and just see what comes back to you. Because again, and I've found this with the various forms of AI that I've used and encountered in my life, it will throw stuff at you that you don't expect. And that's good because that says you had a blind spot. We all have blind spots. I mean, Eve was just talking about emotions. Emotions can motivate us. Emotions can also scare us and blind us to things and get us to make bad decisions, right? You're not supposed to panic when something terrible happens. Don't panic, calm down, think rationally, but use these things and use them as a member of your team. What do you think, Michael?
I think that's sound advice. I mean, the reason that the AI can come up with things that you haven't expected is because it can access such a large amount of data, right?
Mm-hmm.
Humans may be limited by their recent context or their memories, and
Mm-hmm.
we all forget things. So if a machine can access a massive database of facts, it might uncover or synthesize something you didn't expect simply because it was contemplating a much larger collection of things, and we didn't have that in our head.
Right.
So it's a great way to uncover interesting insight from the data. And where a human can then apply judgment is to figure out, okay, what does this really mean in reality? Does it fit the context?
Mm-hmm.
Is it an accurate idea or something that could be improved upon?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, David Sweener, I'll throw it over to you. It's like a really knowledgeable intern who sometimes gets stuff wrong, right?
Yeah, it's really good. And a lot of these different services that are out there, they'll give you citations and you go look them up and you got to use your judgment. Like some of the citations, they're just wonky. Clearly AI written content. I would never cite that any way, any day of my life. And the one thing I've been thinking about, I wrote a Medium blog on this, but there was a paper out called Model Collapse, and it discussed that. And what that essentially is, if you keep training AI on AI, you're going to get gibberish out. So I don't know like what that point is. And I used an image as an example, describe the image. I only did 4 iterations of this, and the last image that came out was completely unrelated to the first one. So
Mm.
that's some things I'm thinking about as more and more content is generated. How do you know what's real? We can't detect that. And if
Mhm.
we're training AI on AI, will these models degrade? I don't know.
Mhm. Well, I mean, so there has been some apparent degradation. Now, it's really hard to say because, first of all, it's a black box, right? ChatGPT, at least right now, is a black box. So it's hard to say exactly what's happening. But I have noticed that it would do certain things very easily 2 months ago, and now it's having a harder time. Now, is that because there's more load on the system? Is that because it is degrading? Is that what Sam Altman was talking about when he said the era of large language models is over? I don't really know. Of course, he's out there now trying to get $7 trillion,
Sure.
right? It's like shoot for the moon, buddy. Go for the gusto, right? I think that's a bit strong, but hey, ask and you shall receive, right? Maybe I'll throw it over to Michael to comment on. You know, we do have to be careful with these things. And I know there is some work being done on studying their efficacy. Of course, all the vendors come out and say, oh, we're 10% more accurate than you, and we're 5% faster, and this and that. It's like the old TPC reports we used to get in the database world. Isn't that what they were called? Like the
Mhm.
TPC benchmarks,
Yeah.
where it's like, okay,
Yeah.
does that really matter in the real world? Not quite as much. I think the general recommendation here is to just be a smart person, be wise, don't dive headlong into this stuff. Always check these things. Be careful how you expose it to your clients, to your partners, to your prospects out there. But still use it and continue to play, knowing that the game is changing every day. What do you think, Michael?
I think one of the biggest challenges that an LM faces to give relevant content is context.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll give you a really simple example that I've used with a lot of customers that I've talked to is one of seasonality. So here's a really simple example. If I run a product business, so if someone goes and says, well, why did your portfolio grow or decline last quarter? Now, you and I would know that because of seasonality, I have to do a quarter to last year quarter comparison. I can't do a sequential quarter comparison because some are stronger quarters than other quarters. But that's a context, it's a convention. It's something we learn from living our lives. How does the LM know that? And therefore, it might
Mm-hmm.
return irrelevant results. Or an LM might tell you about something that an event that occurred 100 years ago when it's not really relevant for today because it's
Mm-hmm.
not a precedent for today. That was too far and too long ago. So we humans are really adept at figuring out contextually what is relevant information. And that's something where large language models struggle.
Hmm.
And it's a huge opportunity for improvement. That's where the human can really help, right? They can bring the
Mhm.
judgment call as to, is this really relevant, and is it relevant to what's happening around us and social
Mm-hmm.
convention and those kinds of things.
Well, that's very interesting. And here's a real hard question. I'll throw it over to you maybe, and then see if Eve or Dave want to comment on it. As you're interacting with one of these models, what I've noticed, it's kind of interesting. I love when it apologizes to you. Like I'll ask it for, hey, tell me about XYZ, and it'll tell me about XYZ. Like, no, I meant this other XYZ. And it'll go, oh, I'm sorry. I misunderstood. And okay, it's like the computer's like, oh, I'm sorry. Please stand by. Like your call is very important to us. Um, so I'm like, you go back and forth with these things. What is the 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 length of the attention span that it can keep to your instructions on something? Do you have any insight on this? In other words, as I'm in a particular thread, I'm like, no, give me this, no, give me that. In the same context, how long does it keep my recent embeddings, if you will, in its mind as it's answering questions? Do you have any thoughts on that, Michael?
There were some studies that came out at one point, shortly to be refuted by some advances in large language models. So you got to take it with a grain of salt. But there
Right.
was some that was done that say that if you prompted a document into the LM, that you found that your accuracy was heavily weighted to the first page and the last page. And
Mhm.
the more
Interesting.
pages you had in between, the less accurate the result was going to be. And that's certainly a window into context and the
Mm,
ability for the LM to absorb context.
mm,
Databases don't struggle from that same issue because they turn everything into a big search, right? When you've structured your data appropriately when loading it, but that context question is one that we don't really have a good understanding. Some of the recent LM advances claim to have solved that problem, but I've not seen any sort of scientific rigor, if you will, that's been brought to determining whether or not they really solve that problem deeply yet. So it is something I think that is an active area of research and improvement.
hmm Okay, well, folks, final segment is coming up next. Don't touch that dial. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, time for the podcast bonus segment here on DM Radio, talking to Eve Mulkers of 7W Data, David Sweener of Alation and Tiny Tech Guides, and Michael Gilfix of KX. And in the break there, Michael, you threw something out that was on my mind. I'm glad you reminded me. That's what AI is good for, and humans too, to remind people of things. I kind of hinted at this earlier that it's hard to untrain a model, right? Like once you've trained the model, it's hard to untrain it. It's like you can't unlearn something. You see that in lots of different places. It's a big issue for change management in organizations now because people are creatures of habit. They do things a certain way. They want to keep doing things a certain way. And when you pull the rug out from underneath them, which is kind of what this Gen AI stuff is doing, at least to marketing people, to content people, to lots of people in the organization, it is disruptive to their day to day workflow. So they're nervous about it, but I have wondered how can you untrain a model? I don't think you can. I think you have to start over again, which is very painful. That's why you want to be very careful of training whatever you're going to train in your organization. And you had mentioned that your RAG is a good way to do that because it's outside the model itself. And thus you can adjust what is outside to change the parameters. I'd mentioned Kong and the gateways, how you can say, okay, if someone does anything political, this trump that, pun intended, if it does anything.
Jeez.
I was actually unintended, but I couldn't help it. You bake that into your RAG model, and you made a great line because it allows you to forget something, right? And what did Mark Twain say? The beautiful of never lying is you never have to remember anything. But go ahead, Michael.
I don't know if Mark Twain really said that, but we'll go with it.
Yeah, he did.
So,
Yeah.
but the ability to forget is actually an advantage to databases in RAG because you're right. When you do the training process, it gets encoded into these parameters. It's not so easy to remove all the parameters. You don't have that level of fine-grained control. In a database, if I just remove those rows in the database, then they can't be returned and supplied to the LM. So it's very easy to forget facts. It's also very easy, by the way, to filter and decide who gets to see certain facts. Because databases are very adept at saying, well, this collection of data can be seen by Joe, and this collection can be seen by Bob. And you can ensure that you can control who gets to see what data. And those are definitely some advantages of the RAG-based approach.
Yeah, if you tell the truth, you don't have to remember. That's what Mark Twain said. It's good stuff too. I mean, because the RAG model can change, your policies can change over time, and so that's kind of where I'm going. Is I think in the future, data governance, data quality are going to get baked into your RAG models because you have to check things, and you'll have something to check. Is kind of the point. And I'm just wondering how sophisticated that can get in terms of a RAG model that first hits your vectors and then goes to the Gen AI and then comes back and maybe hits it a second time just to double check, basically. I think you probably can do that if you want to get really accurate on
I-
these things.
Yeah, I think there's a huge actually opportunity for industry innovation in this area. I refer to this as information evolution.
Hmm.
The security policies that we all had to follow were something 1 year ago than they were 6 months ago versus they are now.
Hmm.
I could forget the old policies until someone then comes along and says, well, wait a minute, what are you doing differently today than you did before? And how do you compare those things? And how do
Mm-hmm.
we actually get a large language model to understand the
Mm-hmm.
difference so it could advise you on what has changed? Imagine trying to do this with the tax code because everyone wants to know which rules changed. How
Right.
do I design my taxes? Could someone advise me on it? And these are huge, huge documents with tons of information to go and compare. And so that's an example of information evolution. After all, the tax code changes constantly. And so, how do you make sense of all of that? How do you track it? And how do you then figure out how to get an advised plan, which a generator should be able to tell me if only it could understand that information evolution?
Mm-hmm. And I'll throw this question over at you first, Michael, and then Eve and David, if you would jump on it. Here is the wild, amazing future I'm seeing. Tell me how realistic this is. You've got your model, you pick your poison, for example, and you want to be very careful um, that it is your private instance. Now you're still using an LLM, right? So you have to have a sophisticated RAG model. But what I think is going to be very interesting is to, of course, train it on your industry ontology, train it on your corporate data, your trusted corporate governed data in your embeddings, and basically set up feeds from your ERP, from your clickstream analysis technology, from your HR, from all your different systems. You set up feeds into your vector database, into your environment, such that the CEO and the senior executive can just sit there all day and ask questions. What should I do next? Which employees are doing a good job? What we have to cut costs? Where should I cut costs? And have it as an always on advisor with all the up-to-date information from your other systems, such that you can just have this playground of ideas and questions and answers to run your business. How realistic is that, Michael?
I think that is realistic. I think that is the prize that people are chasing.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a lot of experimentation to learn about these technologies. I think we're starting to now get to the point where people are saying, okay, if I put these things into production and systems, what does it take to scale it And how do I get it to handle the vastness of data to make the vision that you just described realized? Most of that exploratory is with a fraction of the data you would need to realize the vision of the all-knowing knowledge base, right? So that senior executive can punch in any question and centrally get an answer. And so that's what everyone's starting to get into now, right? How do you tackle that scale problem?
Yeah, that's the big one. Eve, what do you think?
Yeah, exactly. That's what we're chasing, and I've been thinking about that as well. The problem mostly is if you ask somebody three questions and you start asking the fourth and the fifth, they are getting annoyed and they stop answering your questions. So what I've learned with ChatGPT and playing around, you can keep on asking questions and going forward and forward. And if you don't ask the questions, well, they won't answer if you put the question forward. So it's something different than a human interaction. So you will really have to put in the effort to get the answer. And that's something, if you don't put that effort in there, you're not getting the answers. And that's where I think lies in the possibilities where you say, this is the hypothesis, just check it out with all the information available. What would be the next best move that we are taking? But we see very likely the best result we will get by collaborating a few human beings together with the models that can insanely quickly answer those questions, where now you go to IT and within the next 3 months, if you're lucky, you get the answers in such a way. And I think that's the big opportunity, what we see right now.
Yeah, and I'll throw it over to David Swinger to close us out. I also view this whole LLM movement as very disruptive to the business intelligence industry, which has spent many, many years trying to refine. I think Alteryx did a real good job with this magic documents stuff to leverage it. But BI companies had better jump on the bandwagon with this stuff and use the daylights out of it, I think. What do you think, David?
Yeah, I think there's a lot. Every BI and analytic vendor out there is tinkering around with it, because you can ask it how to do something, so it can instruct a non-expert on how to specifically accomplish a task.
Hmm.
Lots of activity there. But I want to go back to your earlier question on data nirvana. Um, I think I see that future, but if you go out and look what's out there, organizations really have no idea where their data is.
Right.
That's a big use case for
That's right.
data. I work for a data intelligence company, but can you find it? Who is using it? Can you trust that data? Should you be using that data? And I think it's really brought the focus back to the data, but it starts with knowing what data you have in your organization. And so this data nirvana, where I'm going to hook everything up to it, I love the idea. Uh, I hope we get there, but people, organizations don't even know what data they have.
Well, it could be good for the data inventory process. I mean, we're going to be pitching data governance as a really important precursor, a prerequisite, if you will, for using Gen AI is get your data house in order,
Mhm.
do a catalog, understand what's out there, do an inventory. And until you've done that, be very careful about loading that stuff into any one of these models because it will come back. Well, folks, send me an
That's
email
right.
if you want to be on the show, info@dmradio.biz. Look these gentlemen up online. We'll talk to you next time. You have been listening to DM Radio.